So, she's hard to look at for me. No, first of all,
For decades, the story of Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers lived somewhere between rumor and reality. Audiences watched them share microphones, exchange playful glances, and lean toward each other in a way that felt too natural to be simple stage chemistry. Fans saw something deeper. Journalists asked the same question again and again. Were they secretly in love? Or was it just the illusion that great performers sometimes create when music carries emotion between two voices? For nearly 40 years, both of them answered with the same calm response. They were friends, nothing more. Yet the way they looked at each other, the way their voices blended on songs like Islands in the Stream, and the way they teased each other in interviews kept the mystery alive. Then, in 2025, long after Kenny Rogers had passed away and long after their last performance together had become a memory, Dolly finally spoke openly about what really existed between them. What she described was not a hidden affair, but something far more complicated, a bond that lived somewhere between friendship, admiration, temptation, and discipline. The kind of connection that might have turned into love if either of them had been willing to risk everything they had already built. But neither of them ever crossed that line. Dolly Rebecca Parton's story began long before Kenny Rogers entered her life. She was born on January 19, 1946, in a tiny cabin tucked deep inside the mountains of Locust Ridge, Tennessee. The house was barely more than a wooden shell sitting among trees and dirt paths in Sevier County. It had one room, no electricity, no running water. In winter, the cold crept through the cracks in the boards, and in summer, the air inside grew thick with humidity and wood smoke. Dolly was the fourth child in a family that would eventually grow to 12 children. Space was never enough, and privacy barely existed. Children slept side by side in narrow beds, or sometimes directly on the floor. Every meal depended on whatever the family could find, grow, or hunt. Cornbread, beans, and whatever small animals Dolly's father managed to catch were often the only food available. Money was almost non-existent. When Dolly was born, her father did not have cash to pay the doctor who delivered her. Instead, he paid with a sack of cornmeal. Years later, Dolly would laugh when she told that story, but the truth behind it reflected the extreme poverty that shaped her earliest years. Yet inside that small cabin lived something stronger than hardship. Dolly's mother, Avie Lee Owens Parton, filled the house with stories and songs. She stitched clothing from feed sacks and scraps of cloth, turning whatever material she could find into dresses for her daughters. At night, she told stories about the Bible, about the mountains, about faith and survival. Those stories helped distract the children from hunger and gave them a sense that their lives mattered even when the world outside their valley barely noticed them. Dolly's grandfather, Jake Owens, was a Pentecostal preacher who traveled through the region leading church services in small wooden buildings where families gathered to sing hymns and pray together. Music flowed through those gatherings like oxygen. When Dolly was just 6 years old, she stood in front of a congregation wearing patched clothes and sang "Jesus Loves Me." Her voice shook with nerves, but something inside her kept pushing her forward. Each week, she returned to the same spot, standing before neighbors and relatives who watched the shy little girl with the powerful voice. The church did not allow instruments during services, but outside the church walls, music lived everywhere. Her father sometimes played fiddle late at night, quietly enough that the strict church elders would not hear. The sound drifted through the house like a secret invitation. When Dolly turned 7, her Uncle Bill Owens gave her a homemade guitar built from a shipping crate lid. The instrument was rough and imperfect, but to Dolly, it felt like treasure. She sat on the wooden porch, barefoot, practicing chords until her fingers burned. Her siblings wandered through the yard chasing chickens or searching the woods for something they could cook for dinner. Dolly stayed with the guitar, turning frustration and hunger into music. By the time she reached the age of 10, she was already appearing on local radio stations. People in nearby towns began to notice the small girl with the enormous voice. School sometimes felt cruel during those years. Dolly wore dresses made from flour sacks because that was the only fabric her family could afford. Other children laughed and called her Sack Girl. The teasing hurt deeply, but instead of breaking her spirit, it pushed her towards songwriting. She began writing little songs to express the feelings she could not explain in conversation. One of her earliest songs was about a neighbor's dog, but over time her writing grew stronger. Eventually, she turned those painful childhood memories into the song Coat of Many Colors, which told the story of a girl whose mother turned scraps of cloth into a beautiful coat filled with love. By the mid-1950s, Dolly's talent was becoming impossible for local audiences to ignore. At age 10, she won a small talent prize from the Easter Seals organization, and the money allowed her to buy her first real guitar. She began performing regularly on a local program called The Cass Walker Show on radio station IVIK. The pay was barely enough to cover gasoline for the trip to the studio, but the opportunity gave her something far more valuable than money. It gave her experience. She learned how to stand in front of microphones, how to control her nerves, and how to deliver emotion through music. At age 11, she stepped onto television for the first time on WBIR-TV, singing a song called Puppy Love. In 1959, the song was recorded and pressed onto a small number of records. Only about 1,000 copies were produced, but it marked her first official recording. People in the region started calling her Little Miss Hillbilly, a nickname that followed her into the early years of her career. Everything changed in the summer of 1964. The day after graduating from high school, Dolly climbed into her Oakle Bills pickup truck carrying a cardboard suitcase filled with clothes and barely $23 in cash. Nashville waited several hours away. The city had already become the center of country music, and Dolly believed it was the only place where her dreams could grow. Her first night in Nashville did not look glamorous. She slept in the truck parked near Tootsie's Orchid Lounge, a famous bar where songwriters and musicians gathered. The next morning, she carried her dirty laundry to a nearby laundromat called the Wishy Washy. That simple chore led to one of the most important meetings of her life. While she was loading clothes into a machine, a young man named Carl Dean walked up and started talking to her. He had noticed the new girl standing outside the laundromat and decided to introduce himself. Dolly later joked that she was surprised he looked directly at her face rather than staring at her legs the way many men did. Their meeting happened less than 24 hours after she arrived in Nashville, and Carl would later become her husband. The early years in Nashville were difficult. Record labels listened to Dolly's voice and said it sounded too country, too mountain, too raw for mainstream audiences. Instead of giving her recording contracts, they offered her work as a songwriter. Dolly accepted because she understood that writing songs could open doors even if she was not allowed to sing them herself. In 1966, one of her songs, Put It Off Until Tomorrow, became a top 10 country hit when it was recorded by Bill Phillips. That success brought Dolly into contact with country star Porter Wagoner, who invited her to join his television show as a regular performer. The show gave Dolly national exposure, but the relationship between her and Porter quickly became complicated. Porter controlled many aspects of her image. He chose the dresses she wore, insisted on elaborate hairstyles, and expected her to follow his creative direction. Dolly smiled for cameras, but privately she grew frustrated. She continued writing songs that expressed her independence, including Just Because I'm a Woman, which challenged the double standards placed on women in relationships. Eventually, she realized that staying under Porter's control would prevent her from building her own identity. In 1974, she wrote I Will Always Love You as a farewell to Porter Wagoner. The song became her first #1 hit as a solo artist. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Dolly's career expanded beyond country music. She began appearing in films and recording crossover hits that reached pop audiences. The 1980 movie 9 to 5 turned her into a major Hollywood star, and the title song became one of the most recognizable anthems about workplace frustration ever recorded. But success came with personal strain. Dolly worked constantly, traveling from concerts to film sets to television appearances. The pressure of fame, combined with family problems and health issues, created a period of emotional exhaustion. In the early 1980s, she experienced depression and struggled with physical illness that eventually required surgery. Despite those challenges, she continued writing songs and performing. It was during this intense period of her life that Kenny Rogers entered the picture. Kenny had already built an extraordinary career before their paths crossed. Born in Houston, Texas in 1938, he grew up in a working-class neighborhood and discovered music through doo-wop groups and folk bands. Over the years, he reinvented himself several times, moving from rock to country to pop and becoming one of the most successful recording artists of the 1970s. Songs like The Gambler, Lucille, and Lady had made him an international star. By the early 1980s, he was known for his distinctive voice and relaxed stage presence. Their first major collaboration came in 1983 when producer Barry Gibb of the Bees invited them to record a duet called Islands in the Stream. The recording session began with tension. Kenny and Barry argued about the arrangement and the balance between their voices. Dolly watched quietly from the side of the